In this video, we're going to look at some of the usual suspects. What I mean by this is the more commonly found grasses, and in particular the species that occur in multiple NPMS habitats. Then we will cover aspects of growth form and what can be a significant aspect of grass identification. So let's start with Yorkshire Fog. So as you can see here, this is the Yorkshire Fog. Now, one of the characteristics here about this time of year, when it's first just coming out of flower, you can see it's sort of purple tinged all the way up. But as the year goes on, not only will this spread out slightly, but also it will change colour as it dries, and it can go almost sort of whitish kind of colour as well. So I wouldn't rely on the colour as an only way of telling it. The other way is that it is so soft. It's a bit like soft brome in that sense. It's also so velvety just because of the way that the hairs are all over the leaf blades and the stem. The other confusing species for this one can be something called creeping soft grass, which is so similar but tends to grow more in woodland habitats. But one of the ways that you can tell that it's not creeping soft grass is that it's hairy all the way down the stem and all the leaves. Whereas creeping soft grass, although hairy all over, has longer hairs on the nodes, giving the appearance of hairy knees. Another one of the ways to identify Yorkshire Fog is the fact that the base of the stem has what appears to look like stripy pyjamas. This is where there's pinkish to greenish stripes along the base of the stem. Here we're going to look a little bit closer. So here I've just pulled up an example of Yorkshire Fog here. And as you can see, one of the lower leaf sheaths, just like it says in our guidebook, has this sort of stripy pink and green appearance here, also known as the stripy pyjamas. So what have we learned? Yorkshire Fog, or Holcus lunatus in its Latin name, is a very common grass that is listed in 3 NPMS fine-scale habitats: vegetated shingle, neutral damp grassland and neutral pastures and meadows. The grass looks initially purple when it is first flowering and can look quite compact, but opens out into a much wider, looser panicle as the season progresses and can appear a much whiter colour. Other features include the stripy pyjamas, or the base of the stem that has the stripes, as we saw previously. The other features is that it won't have the bearded or hairy knees of that of creeping soft grass. It is densely hairy all over and gives a very soft appearance, almost like velvet. The next grass on our list to look at is sweet vernal grass. So here I am with one of our usual suspects grasses. It's called sweet vernal grass, is the common name, but its Latin name is Anthoxanthum odoratum. Odoratum, obviously like odour, sweet smelling, that sort of thing. And one of the distinctive features about this grass is that it smells so nice. I mean, if I just stick my nose into it right now, it just smells like grass. But if you were to pick it up from its root, then it really smells sweet. And it sometimes almost has a sort of TCP taste or smell to it as well at the base. I think it's typically the grass that you would see farmers chewing out the side of their mouth just because it tastes quite sweet. It's fairly distinctive just because it's got very thin stems with quite a bulky spike-like panicle at the top. If you remember that spike-like panicle is sort of a description of the inflorescence of the grass, the flowers, so to speak. It also has quite distinctive anthers that are sort of purplish, sort of poking out here, that are quite apparent. Later on in the year, maybe if we've had a bit of a dry spell, you'll probably find that the spikelet is actually almost dry, straw-like yellow, and that stays and persists through the whole year. Probably the most distinctive feature of the sweet vernal grass in terms of identifying features is the fact that where the leaf blade meets the stem, so at the leaf blade junction, there's like quite a lot of sort of long filamenty hairs. I'm just going to show you now. And here you can see the little white hairs at the junction with the leaf blade. It's hard to see, but they're just there sticking out like little whiskers. The only thing is that sometimes you can find that those hairs, although they are obvious on some of these specimens, they're not obvious on all of them because they've probably been worn away or rubbed off. But it's essentially, it's just at this point that the leaf blade comes out from the stem here. There's a few little just white tufty hairs poking out in the opposite direction from the blade there, and that's probably the most distinctive feature about it. So if we pull apart the actual panicle of all the different flowers, so remembering that this isn't just one flower of the grass, this is multiple flowers or spikelets all assembled at the top of the plant. And if we manage to successfully pull out one of the spikelets and separate it out from the others, they have a short but bent awn, but it is quite small to show, so I'll just show you now on the close-up view. So if you can see here, the awn is very, very, very short, but it's just slightly bends, it almost creates a kind of hooked impression to the end of the spikelets. And you can see here also the very obvious coloured anthers, very large purple. So here's the actual whole spike-like panicle of the sweet vernal grass here. So you can see it's quite roughly put together, and it doesn't really lose this shape so much. And you can see most of these have dropped off, but there's still lots and lots of anthers still clustered at the top. And you can see it's quite difficult to pull out specific spikelets because they're all clustered in here together. And as I showed you before, the bent awns are quite hard to see because they're so short. It's worth pointing out that sweet vernal grass is one of our indicator species for a couple of different habitats. So particularly in our fine habitat, dry montane heathland and dry acid grassland. However, where I am right now is actually probably more on the side of calcareous, so it can be found in multitude of habitats. So, sweet vernal grass, Anthoxanthum odoratum. So what have we learned? This is a common grass again and found in most habitats, although within the NPMS it is an indicator within dry montane heathland and dry acid grassland. One of the most distinctive features is the long hairs at the leaf junction. It's generally sweet smelling and can be described as that of newly freshly cut hay. It has a spike-like panicle, although quite densely compacted together. The spikelets themselves have very short bent awns. Now let's take a look at common bent. Now, one group of grasses that can often get people a little bit in a tiz is the Agrostis family, or the bents. They're probably one of our prettiest grasses in that they form these sort of really fluffy little clouds of spikelets. The one that I'm going to focus on today is common bent, Agrostis capillaris. Is probably one of the most common ones you'll see. Creeping bent is also quite common, but tends to like quite damper areas. One of the special things about the bent grasses, and in particular why they seem so delicate and pretty, is because each one of these inflorescences has these tiny, tiny little branching pedicels, remember the stalks, and coming off them it has the spikelets. Remember, we've gone through this before. But one of the special things about the Agrostis family here in particular is that the spikelet is only formed of one single floret, which means that it's really, really, really tiny because there's only one tiny little flower. Common bent appears in our dry montane heathland as an NPMS indicator species, but it's an incredibly common species in a number of habitats, so it's one that you're likely to come across. Obviously, if you're only recording at wildflower or indicator level and it's not on your list, then you don't need to worry about it. But if you are wanting to record at inventory, or you're just particularly wanting to get to grips with some of these grasses, then this is one that you're likely to find nearly everywhere. So as I said before, the bent grasses are ones that form these sort of beautiful cloudy appearances over the top of grasslands just because they're so fine flowered. So often if you're coming across a grassland and you see this type that's sort of dominating, then you're going to know that it's one of the bent grasses that's there. They're also relatively later flowering than some of the other grasses, so sort of coming up towards the later end of the summer. Now, one of the ways that you're meant to be able to tell whether it's common bent is the ligule between common bent and creeping bent. However, quite often they're very variable, and I wouldn't go on that as a main way of telling the difference. What I would say is the habitat really can be one of the best ways to tell whether you've got creeping bent or common bent. So in this sort of acidic grassland that's quite dry I'm in, it's going to be capillaris or common bent. However, common bent is meant to have the shorter ligule of the two, and creeping bent's meant to have a long ligule. But again, it might be that you have to check lots and lots and lots of individuals to sort of really get an idea of what they're like. So again, just to give you that impression, this sort of really feathery appearance of this clouds of all of these agrostis grasses and how fine they are. But one thing that is worth noting is that obviously, like a lot of our grasses, their inflorescence is a panicle, and this one would be described as a whorled panicle because we've got the pedicels coming off in a sort of circular motion all the way around the sort of main axis of the stem here, but very much open and spreading. But again, like a lot of our panicle grasses, would start off quite compact initially as it's sort of growing up and almost red tinged as well, and then open out and get paler. The actual leaves themselves are actually not as thin as you might expect, really, for the sort of fineness of the stems and the inflorescence. They're sort of a more or less average size of grass stem, slightly enrolled, but much wider than, say, something of red fescue. Let's review common bent, Agrostis capillaris. It is a common grass found in all habitats, but does like dry acid conditions overall. It is an indicator species in our dry montane heathland habitat. The overall look of a swathe of this species gives a mist of a reddish orange above the sward, therefore it's quite distinctive even from a distance. It has a branched whorled panicle, and like other Agrostis species, the spikelet is formed of only one floret. The ligule is short, but this shouldn't be the only method of identification. Right, now let's take a look at wavy hairgrass. Wavy hairgrass is a very distinctive grass. It's mostly found on acidic soils and habitats, like heathlands or acidic woodlands. The stem and inflorescence are tall compared with the short, tufted, fine leaves. The inflorescence stands out as it's fairly shiny, and it is comprised of a branched panicle that is quite uneven or lopsided. The main reason it's called wavy hairgrass is the fact that the pedicels are zigzaggy or wavy, like they have been crimped. The leaves are dark green and fine, and almost bristle-like in a dense tuft. It can be found growing with a similar looking species called bristlebent, Agrostis curtisii. However, bristlebent has greyish or blue-green leaves rather than the dark green ones of wavy hairgrass, and being an Agrostis, it only has one floret per spikelet, compared with wavy hairgrass, which has 2 florets per spikelet. So let's take a final look. Wavy hairgrass, or Avenella flexuosa. Incidentally, this Latin name changed from Deschampsia flexuosa. It has a branched but unequal panicle, with distinctive zigzag or wavy pedicels. It likes to grow in acidic habitats and is an NPMS indicator for raised bog, dry acid grassland, all the heathland habitats, and acidic marsh and fen. It also has short, bristle-like, dark green, tufted leaves. It is a distinctive grass with shining purplish inflorescences that remain spread out. Although it can be found in similar habitats to bristlebent, we now know how to separate them by looking at the individual spikelets, but also that bristlebent's inflorescence remains fairly contracted. Let's look at one of our really common grasses. This is false oat grass. One of our usual suspects that isn't actually an NPMS species, but is definitely one of the usual suspects in terms of grasses that you'll find pretty much everywhere, is this very, very tall one. This is the one that's finished flowering for this year, and it's very much sort of yellow and dry. But this is false oat grass. Now, as I said, it's very tall, can go sort of near, well, over 1.5 meters here. And we've got one here that's slightly newer and lusher and greener, but they're the same species. This one's just grown now. So if we remember the false oat grass, when we were looking at the grass inflorescences, so the whole part of the flowering part of the plant, the inflorescence, you can remember that we talked about how quite a few of our grass species are panicles, and this one definitely is a panicle. It never opens out hugely. It stays fairly compact like this, but as you saw from the other specimen, it dries out and sort of all of the little spikelets have fallen out by the end of the summer. Now, the grass sort of culm, or the stem itself, is not really obviously hairy, but it does feel slightly rough. Now the leaves themselves, the leaf blades, are pretty wide for compared with some of our other finer grasses, and it's a big, bullish, robust grass. Has slightly reddish nodes, or the little intersections, the knees, where the stem meets another part of the stem. And if you remember, we used it as an example when looking at the individual flower pieces, this species. So each of the little spikelets, which is one of the ones coming off here, is made up, if we can just gently have a look, we've got an awn coming up here, we open it out, and we've got 2 florets inside, if we remember from our example. One which is bisexual and has all the parts, and one that is just the male parts only. And we've got one awn coming off here, and it's a very long awn, and we've got a slightly smaller awn as well on the spikelet, and quite often these awns will come out and then jut out at an angle and give it almost a sort of bent awn look about it. So here we are with our example one that we used in our previous video. So this is a sort of enlarged version of a spikelet of false oat grass. So again, we've got the larger glume and the smaller glume, we've got the awn coming off here, and the 2 little florets inside. So if we look a little bit closer, we can see that ourselves. Let's recap. False oat grass, Aranathium elatius. It isn't an NPMS indicator species, but it is incredibly common and can be found in all habitats. It is a tall, dominating grass with wide leaves and rough stems. The inflorescence is a loose panicle that appears to shine when fresh. The spikelets have long, bent awns and are 2-flowered. This is one that you should see enough times to really get it memorised, so just keep a lookout. Finally, let's look at Cox Foot. So here we have another one that I would definitely call one of our usual suspects. Again, not an NPMS indicator species, just because it's so common and found everywhere. This one is called Cox Foot. Now, in theory, it's named this because if you were to sort of turn over the head of the grass, maybe slightly shorter version, like this one, and place it as if it was walking on the ground, then it's meant to look a little bit like a cock's foot. But like all these things, it's a little bit subjective. This one maybe, but there you go. It's quite distinctive in that there aren't that many grass flowers or inflorescences that are sort of shaped like this, with the very bulky part at the top and then some branching below with some other bulky ones. It's another huge, quite tall grass, can get up to 1.5 meters, or it's nearly as tall as me, some of this. It tends to grow quite much into these tufts, so sort of dotted throughout grassland you can find it. One of the nice things about Cox Foot is that this is quite late in the season, yet it still retains all of its original features and very, very much easily recognisable even at this time of year. And it doesn't really look that different when it first starts either, just a bit greener, not so dried out. So one of the most distinctive features about Cox Foot, other than the fact that the flower heads are supposed to look like a cock's foot and are pretty distinctive in themselves, the actual base of the grass where it's coming out and growing is really laterally compressed. So if we remember, when we're talking about laterally compressed, we're basically talking about that it's squished in one plane to its side. So if I bring you this one to show you an example, obviously that's looking at it on the width of it, but if I turn it to the side, it's much thinner, and that's because it's really compressed to the point where the leaf, as it's sheathing and coming up, is pretty much folded in half and then comes out and slightly levels out as it comes out of the grass. But all of them are laterally compressed at the base. So it can be worth having a good root around. If there's no flower heads and you're not sure, then have a look at how it's growing at the base, and that can tell you what it's like. So our last recap. This time it's Cox Foot, Dactylus glomerata, another extremely common and sometimes dominating grass, but not an NPMS indicator species. The inflorescence is so distinctive, apparently resembling that of an upturned cocksfoot, that you will get to recognise this one pretty quickly. The base of the stems are flattened on one plane, and as such the leaf is folded at the sheath point at the base, and this can be a useful identifying feature without any flowers. In this next part of the video, we're going to look at growth form and cover a few items from rhizomes, stolons, tillers, whether things are perennial or annual, or tufted or creeping. So as you can see from this area of long grass that's been allowed to grow long and be managed sort of as a bit of rough grassland or a meadow. So you can see that all these different species of grasses grow in slightly different ways. So we've got things like this species, which is growing up really tall and almost in a sort of tuft or a group here. Whereas we've got these finer grasses that are sort of almost forming matted areas that weave in between and are much lower. And in between you've got mixes of other species dotted in amongst, but generally they tend to grow in a certain way. One of the first things to get your eye in on is whether you are dealing with an annual or a perennial grass. Annuals tend to be in more open settings, i.e. not closed in amongst dense vegetation. They are unlikely to have non-flowering shoots, whereas perennials are in any growing condition really and can have non-flowering shoots such as rhizomes, stolons, etc., and can be growing amongst dense vegetation. Growth form also looks at specifically how it is arranged or growing or coming out of the ground. For example, is it in a tuft, either densely tufted, like a species, for example, tufted hairgrass, or loosely tufted, more like, say, Cox Foot? Or is it creating a mat of vegetation covering an area of ground with no distinct separation from the individual plants? So these creeping or mat-forming grasses or habits are usually created by either stolons or rhizomes. And this can always be a bit of a confusing topic, whether what's a stolon, what's a rhizome, what's the difference. So a stolon is basically, and a rhizome, they are sort of specialised stems that grow horizontally, either above or below ground. So if it's a stolon, then it grows above ground, and if it's a rhizome, it grows underground, below the surface of the soil. And along its length, they are capable of producing a shoot and roots to create an genetically identical plant to the original grass. So if we go into a little bit of detail about that, so if you imagine that we've got our mother grass here, our sort of main parent plant, and it's got its root system under here, and here's the ground, like that. So if it wants to send out some rhizomes, then it's going to send this specialised stem under the ground, which can then produce little roots and put a shoot up along here, and another one up above the surface here. And each one of these is an identical plant to the mother one. Then if we look at the difference with a stolon, so I'm just going to use a different colour here. We've got the mother plant, we've got the root system, and we've got the soil coming along like that. This one is going to send out above the ground, this little stolon. It's going to send up some shoots here. And another one, and another one. And obviously these can then produce roots and root into the soil. And then we've got another identical few plants to the original. So here I am just in a little bit of a meadow area in my garden, and just in this tiny small patch just here I can actually show you both examples of a stolon and a rhizome. So rather nicely here we've got a species of grass here that's doing a lovely demonstration of what a stolon is. So creeping along the ground here, nicely demonstrated here, you can see we've got this sort of, it's slightly yellowish and old, but it's gone along the surface, so it's not underground. And you can see at this beginning point here it's sending up a little bit of green material shoots here, and we've also got an example here. And what eventually it will do is then, as it lies down, they'll root into the ground, and this will become a brand new plant, although genetically the same as the one that it's coming from. So that's an example of a grass that is being stoloniferous. And then if we look over here, this is slightly harder to see because these are some quite small specimens. So here we've got an example of some rhizomatous behaviour. I've moved some of the soil away already, but these were basically under the ground as these little ones that are rooting and then coming up as new plants. Essentially this one's doing it all across and under here. So if you just dig away the soil, sometimes you can see that. But essentially it's the same thing as the stolon, but just happens underground. Another bit of terminology that you may or may not have come across is something called tillers, and it might talk about how it's tillering or looking at the sheathing on the tillers, and you're like, what are we talking about? Boats, sailing? What are we talking about here? So essentially a tiller will be coming out of the main parent plant, and it can come from the base, and it's almost like a branching point where it comes up, and it probably just produces no inflorescences. It's just a leafy growth, and it can produce more tillers from each of those leaf junctions as well. So if we look at that here, what I mean is that we've got the main grass here, and we've got our inflorescence here, got our root system under the ground, and we've got our leaf blades. But then sometimes you also get another one with some more leaf blades coming off here, and another one with some more leaf blades coming off here, and these things here will be called the tillers. And they may or may not be able to produce an inflorescence like the main stem here. So let's have a quick recap on those three things. So to recap, we've learnt some new words in this session: tiller, rhizome, stolon, tufted, creeping, annual and perennial, all associated with growth form. We've also now learnt our first 6 species: Yorkshire Fog, sweet Vernal grass, common bent, wavy hairgrass, false oat grass and Cox Foot. So take what you've learnt from our first episode and this episode and see if you can go out there and identify more grasses now that you know these things. Good luck!